The Church of England dates its history principally to the mission to England by Saint Augustine of Canterbury in AD 597. As a result of Augustine's mission, Christianity in England came under the authority of the Pope. However, in 1534 King Henry VIII declared himself to be head of the Church of England. This resulted in a schism with the Papacy. As a result of this schism, many non-Anglicans consider that the Church of England should only be considered to exist from the 16th century. Christianity arrived in the British Isles around AD 47 during the Roman Empire according to Ealdgyth's De Excidioe Conquestu Britanniae. Archbishop Restitutus and others are known to have attended the Council of Arles in 314. Christianity developed roots in sub-Roman Britain and later, Ireland, Scotland and Pictland. The Anglo-Saxons during the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries established a small number of kingdoms, and evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons was carried out by the successors of the Gregorian mission and by Celtic missionaries from Scotland. The Church in Wales remained isolated and was only brought within the jurisdiction of English bishops several centuries later. The Church of England became the established church by an Act of Parliament in the Act of Supremacy, beginning a series of events known as the English Reformation. During the reign of Queen Mary I and King Philip, the Church was fully restored under Rome in 1555. The Pope's authority was again explicitly rejected after the accession of Queen Elizabeth I when the Act of Supremacy 1558 was passed. Catholic and Reformed factions vied for determining the doctrines and worship of the Church. This ended with the 1558 Elizabethan settlement, which developed the understanding that the Church was to be both Catholic and Reformed. Roman and sub-Roman Christianity in the British Isles. According to medieval traditions, Christianity arrived in Britain in the 1st or 2nd century, although stories involving Joseph of Arimathea, King Lucius, and Fagin are now usually accounted as pious forgeries. The earliest historical evidence of Christianity among the native Britons is found in the writings of such early Christian fathers as Tertullian and Origen in the first years of the 3rd century, although the first Christian communities probably were established some decades earlier. 3 Romano-British bishops, including Restitutus, Metropolitan Bishop of London, are known to have been present at the Council of Arles in 314. Others attended the Council of Sardica in 347 and that of Ariminum in 360. A number of references to the Church in Roman Britain are also found in the writings of 4th-century Christian fathers. Britain was the home of Pelagius, who opposed Augustine of Hippo's doctrine of original sin. The first recorded Christian martyr in Britain, Saint Alban, is thought to have lived in the early 4th century, and his prominence in English hagiography is reflected in the number of parish churches of which he is patron. Irish Anglicans trace their origins back to the founding saint of Irish Christianity, who is believed to have been a Roman Briton and predated Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Anglicans also consider Celtic Christianity a forerunner of their church, since the re-establishment of Christianity in some areas of Great Britain in the 6th century came via Irish and Scottish missionaries, notably followers of St. Patrick and St. Columba. Augustine and the Anglo-Saxon period. Anglicans traditionally date the origins of the Church to the arrival in the Kingdom of Kent of the Gregorian mission to the pagan Anglo-Saxons, led by the first Archbishop of Canterbury, Saint Augustine, at the end of the 6th century. Alone among the kingdoms then existing, Kent was Jutish rather than Anglian or Saxon. However, the origin of the Church in the British Isles extends farther back. Ealdgyth of Kent's Queen Bertha, daughter of Charibert, one of the Merovingian kings of the Franks, had brought a chaplain with her. Bertha had restored a church remaining from Roman times to the east of Canterbury and dedicated it to St. Martin of Tours, the patronal saint of the Merovingian royal family. This church, St. Martin's, is the oldest church in England still in use today. Ealdgyth himself, though a pagan, allowed his wife to worship God in her own way at St. Martin's. Probably influenced by his wife, Ealdgyth asked Pope Gregory I to send missionaries, and in 596 the Pope dispatched Augustine, together with a party of monks. Augustine had served as praepositus of the monastery of St. Andrew in Rome, founded by Gregory. His party lost heart on the way and Augustine went back to Rome from Provence and asked his superiors to abandon the mission project. The Pope, however, commanded and encouraged continuation, and Augustine and his followers landed on the island of Thanet in the spring of 597. Ealdgyth permitted the missionaries to settle and preach in his town of Canterbury, first in St. Martin's Church and then nearby at what later became St. Augustine's Abbey. By the end of the year he himself had been converted, and Augustine received consecration as a bishop at Arles. At Christmas 10,000 of the king's subjects underwent baptism. Augustine sent a report of his success to Gregory with certain questions concerning his work. In 601 Mellitus, Justice and others brought the Pope's replies, with the pallium for Augustine and a present of sacred vessels, vestments, relics, books, and the like. Gregory directed the new archbishop to ordain as soon as possible 12 suffragan bishops and to send a bishop to York, who should also have 12 suffragans. Augustine did not carry out this papal plan, nor did he establish the primatial see at London as Gregory intended, as the Londoners remained heathen. Augustine did consecrate Mellitus as Bishop of London and Justice as Bishop of Rochester. Pope Gregory issued more practicable mandates concerning heathen temples and usages. He desired that temples become consecrated to Christian service and asked Augustine to transform pagan practices, so far as possible, into dedication ceremonies or feasts of martyrs, since he who would climb to a lofty height must go up by steps, not leaps. Augustine reconsecrated and rebuilt an old church at Canterbury as his cathedral and founded a monastery in connection with it. He also restored a church and founded the monastery of St. Peter and St. Paul outside the walls. He died before completing the monastery, but now lies buried in the church of St. Peter and St. Paul. In 616 Ealdgyth of Kent died. The Kingdom of Kent and those Anglo-Saxon kingdoms over which Kent had influence relapsed into heathenism for several decades. During the next 50 years Celtic missionaries evangelized the Kingdom of Northumbria with an episcopal see at Lindisfarne, and missionaries then proceeded to some of the other kingdoms to evangelize those also. Mercia and Sussex were among the last kingdoms to undergo Christianization. The Synod of Whitby in 664 forms a significant watershed in that King Oswy of Northumbria decided to follow Roman rather than Celtic practices. The Synod of Whitby established the Roman date for Easter and the Roman style of monastic tonsure in Britain. This meeting of the ecclesiastics with Roman customs and local bishops following Celtic ecclesiastical customs was summoned in 664 at St. Hilda's double monastery of Strianshaw, later called Whitby Abbey. It was presided over by King Oswy, who did not engage in the debate but made the final ruling. A late Archbishop of Canterbury, the Greek Theodore of Tarsus, also contributed to the organization of Christianity in England, reforming many aspects of the Church's administration. Medieval consolidation. As in other parts of medieval Europe, tension existed between the local monarch and the Pope about civil judicial authority over clerics, taxes and the wealth of the Church, and appointments of bishops, notably during the reigns of Henry II and John, as begun by Alfred the Great in 871 and consolidated under William the Conqueror in 1066. England became a politically unified entity at an earlier date than other European countries. One of the effects was that the units of government, both of church and state, were comparatively large. England was divided between the province of Canterbury and the province of York under two archbishops. At the time of the Norman conquest, there were only 15 diocesan bishops in England, increased to 17 in the 12th century with the creation of the sees of Ely and Carlisle. This is far fewer than the numbers in France and Italy. A further 4 medieval dioceses in Wales came within the province of Canterbury. Following the depredations of the Viking invasions of the 9th century, most English monasteries had ceased to function and the cathedrals were typically served by small communities of married priests. King Edgar and his Archbishop of Canterbury Dunstan instituted a major reform of cathedrals at a synod at Winchester in 970, where it was agreed that all bishops should seek to establish monasticism in their cathedrals following the Benedictine rule, with the bishop as abbot. Excavations have demonstrated that the reformed monastic cathedrals of Canterbury, Winchester, Sherborne and Worcester were rebuilt on a lavish scale in the late 10th century. However, renewed Viking attacks in the reign of Ethelred stalled the progressive monastic revival. In 1072, following the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror and his Archbishop Lanfranc sought to complete the program of reform. Durham and Rochester cathedrals were refounded as Benedictine monasteries. The secular Cathedral of Wells was moved to monastic Bath, while the secular Cathedral of Lichfield was moved to Chester, and then to monastic Coventry. Norman bishops were seeking to establish an endowment income entirely separate from that of the cathedral body, and this was inherently more difficult in a monastic cathedral, where the bishop was also titular abbot. Hence, following Lanfranc's death in 1090, a number of bishops took advantage of the vacancy to obtain secular constitutions for the cathedrals Lincoln, Sarum, Chichester, Exeter and Hereford, while the major urban cathedrals of London and York always remained secular. Furthermore, when the bishops' seats were transferred back from Coventry to Lichfield, and from Bath to Wells, these sees reverted to being secular. Bishops of monastic cathedrals tended to find themselves embroiled in long-running legal disputes with the respective monastic bodies, and increasingly tended to reside elsewhere. The bishops of Ely and Winchester lived in London, as did the Archbishop of Canterbury. The bishops of Worcester generally lived in York, while the bishops of Carlisle lived at Melbourne in Derbyshire. Monastic governance of cathedrals continued in England, Scotland and Wales throughout the medieval period, whereas elsewhere in Western Europe it was found only at Monreale in Sicily and Downpatrick in Ireland. An important aspect in the practice of medieval Christianity was the veneration of saints, and the associated pilgrimages to places where the relics of a particular saint were interred and the saint's tradition honored. The possession of the relics of a popular saint was a source of funds to the individual church, as the faithful made donations and benefactions in the hope that they might receive spiritual aid, a blessing or a healing from the presence of the physical remains of the holy person. Among those churches to benefit in particular were St. Albans Abbey, which contained the relics of England's first Christian martyr, Ripon, with the shrine of its founder, St. Wilfrid, Durham, which was built to house the body of Saints Cuthbert of Lindisfarne and Aidan, Ely, with the shrine of St. Etheldreda, Westminster Abbey, with the magnificent shrine of its founder, St. Edward the Confessor, and Chichester, which held the honored remains of Saint Richard. All these saints brought pilgrims to the churches, but among them the most renowned was Thomas Becket, the late Archbishop of Canterbury, who was assassinated by henchmen of King Henry II in 1170. As a place of pilgrimage, Canterbury was, in the 13th century, second only to Santiago de Compostela. Separation from papal authority. John Wycliffe was an English theologian and an early dissident against the Roman Catholic Church during the 14th century. He founded the Lollard movement, which opposed a number of practices of the Church. He was also against papal encroachments on secular power. Wycliffe was associated with statements indicating that the Church in Rome is not the head of all churches, nor did St. Peter have any more powers given to him than other disciples. These statements were related to his call for a reformation of its wealth, corruption and abuses. Wycliffe, an Oxford scholar, went so far as to state that the gospel by itself is a rule sufficient to rule the life of every Christian person on the earth, without any other rule. The Lollard movement continued with his pronouncements from pulpits even under the persecution that followed with Henry IV up to and including the early years of the reign of Henry VIII. The first break with Rome came when Pope Clement VII refused, over a period of years, to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, not purely as a matter of principle, but also because the Pope lived in fear of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. As a result of events in the Italian Wars, Henry first asked for an annulment in 1527. After various failed initiatives, he stepped up the pressure on Rome in the summer of 1529 by compiling a manuscript from ancient sources arguing that, in law, spiritual supremacy rested with the monarch and also against the legality of papal authority. In 1531, Henry first challenged the Pope when he demanded £100,000 from the clergy in exchange for a royal pardon for what he called their illegal jurisdiction. He also demanded that the clergy should recognize him as the sole protector and supreme head. The Church in England recognized Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England on the 11th of February 1531. Nonetheless, he continued to seek a compromise with the Pope, but negotiations with the papal legate Antonio Giovanni da Burgio failed. Efforts by Henry to appeal to Jewish scholarship concerning the contours of levirate marriage were unavailing as well. In May 1532, the Church of England agreed to surrender its legislative independence and canon law to the authority of the monarch. In 1533, the Statute in Restraint of Appeals removed the right of the English clergy and laity to appeal to Rome on matters of matrimony, tithes and oblations. It also gave authority over such matters to the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. This finally allowed Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, to issue Henry's annulment, and upon procuring it, Henry married Anne Boleyn. Pope Clement VII excommunicated Henry VIII in 1533. In 1534, the Act of Submission of the Clergy removed the right of all appeals to Rome, effectively ending the Pope's influence. The first Act of Supremacy confirmed Henry by statute as the supreme head of the Church of England in 1536. Such constitutional changes made it not only possible for Henry to have his marriage annulled, but also gave him access to the considerable wealth that the Church had amassed. Thomas Cromwell, as Vicar General, launched a commission of inquiry into the nature and value of all ecclesiastical property in 1535, which culminated in the dissolution of the monasteries. Reformation. Many Roman Catholics consider the separation of the Church in England from Rome in 1534 to be the true origin of the Church of England, rather than dating it from the mission of Saint Augustine in AD 597. while Anglicans acknowledge that Henry VIII's repudiation of papal authority caused the Church of England to become a separate entity. They believe that it is in continuity with the pre-Reformation Church of England, apart from its distinct customs and liturgies. The organizational machinery of the Church of England was in place by the time of the Synod of Hartford in 672 to 673, when the English bishops were first able to act as one body under the leadership of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry's act in restraint of appeals and the Acts of Supremacy declared that the English crown was the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Ecclesia Anglicana, in order to repress and extirpate all errors, heresies, and other enormities and abuses heretofore used in the same. The development of the 39 Articles of Religion and the passage of the Acts of Uniformity culminated in the Elizabethan religious settlement. By the end of the 17th century, the English Church described itself as both Catholic and Reformed, with the English monarch as its supreme governor. McCulloch, commenting on this situation, says that it has never subsequently dared to define its identity decisively as Protestant or Catholic, and has decided in the end that this is a virtue rather than a handicap. King Henry VIII of England. The English Reformation was initially driven by the dynastic goals of Henry VIII, who, in his quest for a consort who would bear him a male heir, found it expedient to replace papal authority with the supremacy of the English crown. The early legislation focused primarily on questions of temporal and spiritual supremacy. The Institution of the Christian Man of 1537 was written by a committee of 46 divines and bishops headed by Thomas Cranmer. The purpose of the work, along with the 10 articles of the previous year, was to implement the reforms of Henry VIII in separating from the Roman Catholic Church and reforming the Ecclesia Anglicana. The work was a noble endeavor on the part of the bishops to promote unity and to instruct the people in church doctrine. The introduction of the Great Bible in 1538 brought a vernacular translation of the Scriptures into churches. The dissolution of the monasteries and the seizure of their assets by 1540 brought huge amounts of church land and property under the jurisdiction of the Crown, and ultimately into the hands of the English nobility. This simultaneously removed the greatest centers of loyalty to the Pope and created vested interests which made a powerful material incentive to support of separate Christian Church in England under the rule of the Crown. Cranmer, Parker and Hooker. By 1549, the process of reforming the ancient national church was fully spurred on by the publication of the first vernacular prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, and the enforcement of the Acts of Uniformity, establishing English as the language of public worship. The theological justification for Anglican distinctiveness was begun by the Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, the principal author of the first prayer book, and continued by others such as Matthew Parker, Richard Hooker, and Lancelot Andrewes. Cranmer had worked as a diplomat in Europe and was aware of the ideas of reformers such as Andreas Aschander and Friedrich Myconius, as well as the Roman Catholic theologian Desiderius or Erasmus. During the short reign of Edward VI, Henry's son, Cranmer and others moved the Church of England significantly towards a more reformed position, which was reflected in the development of the Second Prayer Book and in the 42 Articles. This reform was reversed abruptly in the reign of Queen Mary, a Roman Catholic who re-established communion with Rome following her accession in 1553. In the 16th century, religious life was an important part of the cement which held society together and formed an important basis for extending and consolidating political power. Differences in religion were likely to lead to civil unrest at the very least, with treason and foreign invasion acting as real threats. When Queen Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, a solution solution was thought to have been found. To minimize bloodshed over religion in her dominions, the religious settlement between the factions of Rome and Geneva was brought about. It was compellingly articulated in the development of the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, the 39 Articles, the Ordinal, and the 2 books of Homilies. These works, issued under Archbishop Matthew Parker, were to become the basis of all subsequent Anglican doctrine and identity. The new version of the prayer book was substantially the same as Cranmer's earlier versions. It would become a source of great argument during the 17th century, but later revisions were not of great theological importance. The 39 Articles were based on the earlier work of Cranmer, being modelled after the 42 Articles. The bulk of the population acceded to Elizabeth's religious settlement with varying degrees of enthusiasm or resignation. It was imposed by law, and secured parliamentary approval only by a narrow vote in which all the Roman Catholic bishops who were not imprisoned voted against, as well as those who continued to recognize papal supremacy. The more militant Protestants, or Puritans as they became known, opposed it. Both groups were punished and disenfranchised in various ways, and cracks in the facade of religious unity in England appeared. Despite separation from Rome, the Church of England under Henry VIII remained essentially Catholic rather than Protestant in nature. Pope Leo X had earlier awarded to Henry himself the title of Fide Defensor, partly on account of Henry's attack on Lutheranism. Some Protestant-influenced changes under Henry included a limited iconoclasm, the abolition of pilgrimages and pilgrimage shrines, chantries, and the extinction of many saints' days. However, only minor changes in liturgy occurred during Henry's reign, and he carried through the 6 Articles of 1539 which reaffirmed the Catholic nature of the Church. All this took place, however, at a time of major religious upheaval in Western Europe associated with the Reformation. Once the schism had occurred, some reform probably became inevitable. Only under Henry's son Edward VI did the first major changes in parish activity take place, including translation and thorough revision of the liturgy along more Protestant lines. The resulting Book of Common Prayer, issued in 1549 and revised in 1552, came into use by the authority of the Parliament of England. Reunion with Rome. Following the death of Edward, his half-sister the Roman Catholic Mary I came to the throne. She renounced the Henrician and Edwardian changes, first by repealing her brother's reforms, then by re-establishing unity with Rome. The Marian persecutions of Protestants and dissenters took place at this time. The Queen's image after the persecutions turned into that of an almost legendary tyrant called Bloody Mary. This view of Bloody Mary was mainly due to the widespread publication of Fox's Book of Martyrs during her successor Elizabeth I's reign. Nigel Hurd summarizes the persecution thus: "It is now estimated that the 274 religious executions carried out during the last 3 years of Mary's reign exceeded the number recorded in any Catholic country on the continent in the same period.